The day my grandmother fell, no one came. Not my mother, not my sister, just me, because I happened to stop by and find her bruised on the kitchen floor, whispering my name. While they were busy finalizing catering menus and booking tents for a party, I was the one holding her hand as she winced in pain. They didn't postpone anything. They didn't even call. When she died a week later, they cried at the funeral like they'd lost something irreplaceable. But the truth is, they lost her long before, when they chose appearances over love and convenience over care. And now they want her house, her things, her memory, as if you can claim affection like an inheritance. I didn't expect to fight my own family in court. But maybe this fight wasn't about property. Maybe it was about proving who actually showed up when it mattered. And the person who filmed what she said that night, he never expected it would change everything. Before we jump into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love hearing how far our stories reach. Every comment connects us, reminding us how powerful storytelling truly is. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you're always first in line for the next chapter. Now, let's get comfortable, because this story promises to take you on an unforgettable ride. Let's begin. The morning began like any other, with the low hum of the kettle and the scent of pancake batter clinging to the air. I stood in our small kitchen, flipping pancakes on the skillet, only to burn one side, again. Before I could apologize, I heard her gentle chuckle from behind me. "Burnt makes it better," Edith said, settling into her chair with the kind of grace only age and love could shape. "Don't stress it, hun. You know I like a little crunch." We shared breakfast like we always did, in the heart of that creaky wooden cabin overlooking Lakewood. Sunlight streamed through the frosted windows, casting golden stripes across the table. The place smelled like Earl Grey and maple syrup. Our spoons clinked softly against old porcelain plates while we talked about the first snow coming next week. "Make sure to pick up some road salt, Clarence," she reminded me as she sipped her tea, her eyes twinkling. "Last year you nearly slid all the way down the drive like a fool." I laughed, nodding, already picturing myself doing just that. The cabin, old as it was, breathed with us. Floorboards creaked like friendly ghosts. Framed black and white photos lined the walls, capturing the years neither of us ever spoke about in full, but felt deeply. There was peace here, a quiet rhythm we both cherished. That afternoon, I returned to work. HVAC calls never stopped in October, and I had promised the Campbell house I'd fix their heating before the freeze. My phone buzzed just as I was packing up. It was Rita, our neighbor. "Clarence, it's your grandmother. I heard a thump next door. I think she fell." I called 911. The next moments blurred, driving back like a madman, flashing lights bouncing off the windows, paramedics rushing inside. I barely registered the neighbors gathered on the sidewalk. When I reached the stretcher, she was limp, her face pale and slack. One EMT whispered to another. I clutched her hand. At the hospital, they told me she'd gone into cardiac arrest on the way. There was nothing more they could do. I sat in that sterile room, beside a body that still felt like her, unable to move. And then I did what I thought was right. I began to call the family, one by one. Marla, Dad, my stepmom, Amber. Nobody picked up. Voicemails. I texted them. Minutes later, Marla texted back. "Oh no, that's awful. But you know, Amber's turning 35. We've had this resort trip booked all year. You understand, right?" I stared at the screen, rereading the message. Nothing about coming home, nothing about Edith, just balloons, cake, a beachside suite somewhere. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I did what had to be done. I called the funeral home. I picked a photo, one where Edith was smiling, holding her garden trowel. I found the navy dress she always loved and made sure they had it. I printed flyers for the service and drove around Lakewood to hand them out to neighbors. I called Reverend Jones, who still remembered the hymn she used to hum on Sundays. No family called back. Not once. Not a single question about the arrangements, the burial, the urn. Nothing. That night, I stood in our living room where she once danced barefoot after baking cookies. I reached into her chair and pulled out the wool cardigan she always wore, the one with frayed cuffs and buttons shaped like tiny apples. I held it to my chest, breathing in her scent. The room was too quiet now, and I felt like a child again, more alone than I'd been in decades. "I won't let you go alone," I whispered into the silence. "You deserve better than that." The funeral was quiet, humble. Maybe 12 people in total, neighbors who remembered Edith from Sunday potlucks, the local pastor with his leather-bound Bible, and Ruth, her oldest friend, wheeled in by her home nurse. There were no grand floral displays, no slideshow of memories, no family members lined up in somber rows. Just a wooden urn, a few folding chairs, and the wind whispering through the pines. I stood in front of them all and unfolded a piece of paper I had rewritten 3 times that morning. My voice caught more than once, but I kept going. I talked about how she loved peonies more than roses, how she never missed a Turner Classic Movies weekend, and how, during one brutal winter when I was 14, she bundled up and helped me shovel the driveway because she didn't want me to grow up soft. The crowd smiled, some teared up, but no one else came forward to speak. It had always just been us. After the service, as the last of the guests trickled away, I sat alone on the chapel bench and pulled out my phone. I shouldn't have, but I did. Curiosity? Habit? Hope? Amber had posted an album, 35 pictures, each more lavish than the last. She was in a red cocktail dress, laughing with a champagne flute in hand, standing next to a 3-tiered cake shaped like a flamingo. The caption read, "35 and thriving, nothing like celebrating with family. Chak blessed hashashchar resort life." I scrolled further. Marla in sunglasses, posing by a palm tree, my stepdad grilling by the pool, my stepmom in a wide-brimmed hat and white linen dress. They were all there. All of them. The same people who didn't pick up the phone, who didn't send flowers, who didn't ask when the service was. Not a single mention of Edith. Not even a candle emoji. I sat there, letting that sink in. Not just the absence, but the pride in their absence. They weren't hiding. They were celebrating. Smiling for the camera like they hadn't just erased someone. Ruth rolled up beside me later, her hands folded in her lap. Her voice, though thin, still carried warmth. "You know, Edith used to tell me, Clarence is the only one who calls me every night when it snows. Said it helped her sleep, just hearing another voice." She paused, looking out the chapel window. I once asked her if her daughters ever called. She just smiled a little, but she didn't say a word. I turned away so she wouldn't see the tears welling in my eyes. That silence Ruth described, it held more truth than any eulogy I could write. Edith hadn't just loved me like a grandson. She had needed me to be one, because no one else had stepped up. That night, I didn't drive back to my apartment. I couldn't. The cabin was hers, but it was also ours. It felt wrong to leave it empty. I let myself in with the spare key still hidden under the chipped turtle statue by the steps. The kitchen light was on, left that way because Edith liked it welcoming. Her cardigan, the same one I clutched days earlier, still draped over the sofa like she'd just stepped out to water the plants. I walked through the house in silence, every step echoing louder than I remembered. The photos on the wall didn't smile back the way they used to. The teacup she left in the sink still had a faint lipstick stain. Everything was in its place, except her. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room, The same room where she used to hum while folding laundry, where she'd read the paper and tap her fingers on the nightstand to old jazz tunes. The silence now felt sharp, like a note held too long. "I've never felt this house so empty," I whispered, staring at the ceiling, even though it was never crowded. I wasn't born into Edith's world. I was dropped into it, quietly, inconveniently, like a suitcase no one had packed for. I was 12 when my mom left. One morning, she kissed the top of my head and said she'd be back by dinner. She never was. The divorce papers had been signed, and apparently, so had her parental obligations. I didn't know it then, but she'd called Edith the night before and told her, "He's yours now." Edith wasn't even my grandmother. She was my mom's aunt, her weird old aunt who lived by the lake. She had no kids, never married. She lived in a small cabin on the edge of Lakewood and grew tomatoes in mismatched ceramic pots. She didn't hug me that first night, just pointed to a quilt-covered bed and said, "Bathroom's down the hall. I hope you like oatmeal." She never asked me to call her anything in particular, but by the time I turned 15, Edith felt too formal, too thin for the woman who made my lunch every day, taught me how to sew a button, and stood in the pouring rain during my HVAC certification final, wrapped in 2 ponchos and clapping like I'd won the Super Bowl. I called her Grandma, and she never corrected me. Not once. There were sacrifices, hers and mine. When she slipped on ice and broke her hip, I was 3 months away from moving to Phoenix for a better job. I canceled the lease and stayed. When the winters got harsher, I installed a wall heater, replaced the cracked water tank, and started waking up early to salt the steps and scrape the windshield of her old Buick. I never billed her for a thing. Never thought to. It wasn't charity. It was home. But the rest of the family never saw it that way. Marla, at some family barbecue years ago, laughed over her Chardonnay and said, "What's Clarence gonna get? A room in a drafty cabin? He just freeloaded off Edith for years." Amber chimed in. She kept him around so she wouldn't have to pay for a handyman. At the time, I laughed with them, pretended it didn't sting, pretended I didn't wonder if they were right. But now, with Edith gone, and the silence in that house echoing louder than any insult, I knew the truth. If I hadn't stayed, she would have been alone. Utterly, devastatingly alone. She didn't keep me out of convenience. She kept me because we made each other less lonely in a world that often forgets the people who slip through its cracks. A few days after the funeral, I got a call from a law firm in town, Wilkes and Dobson. The receptionist said they were handling Edith's estate and asked me to come in for a reading of the will. I didn't say yes right away. I just sat there for a second, staring at the phone, wondering what Edith could have possibly left behind besides sweaters and teacups. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something kept tugging at me, like a whisper I couldn't quite make out. Around 3 a.m., I got out of bed and wandered into her room. The drawer in the cedar chest beside her armchair was always hard to open. Edith used to say it stuck because the damn wood's sentimental. I pulled it open slowly, half expecting nothing. There it was, a yellow file folder, thick, neatly labeled in her handwriting, "Clarence, for after." Inside was a sealed copy of her will, dated and notarized over a year ago. I ran my fingers over the embossed edge, the notary stamp still sharp. I hadn't known she'd done this, not told me, not hinted, but she'd planned. For me. She always planned ahead. For the weather, for her tomatoes, for my heart. The building was older than it looked from the outside. One of those squat brick places in downtown Flint where the blinds were always half closed and the carpet smelled faintly of copy toner and dust. I wore my cleanest button-down, the one with the frayed collar that Edith had insisted still looked decent enough for a good handshake. In my hand, I clutched a knit cap like it was a shield. My stomach hadn't stopped turning since I parked the car. Inside, the waiting room was quiet. too quiet. They were already there. Marla sat stiff and sharp, a navy blazer hugged too tight around her shoulders like armor. Amber, radiant in a white faux fur coat and glimmering earrings, scrolled lazily on her phone. My stepfather, Gerald, tapped out something on his screen with mechanical indifference, not once looking up as I entered. No one said hi. No one asked about the funeral. I sat across from them, trying not to fidget, but the silence was heavy, like the air didn't want to be breathed in. After a few minutes, a voice called from the hallway. "Mr. Doyle, Miss Maynard, Ms. Amber, Mr. Green, you can come in now." It was Janice Lang, the estate attorney. Mid-60s, no nonsense, gray suit with a tiny sunflower pin on her lapel. Her expression was unreadable. We followed her into a modest conference room. A pot of stale coffee steamed half-heartedly on a side table. The chairs squeaked as we sat. Amber leaned in toward Marla and whispered, "Hopefully she left something to someone who deserves it." I heard it. I didn't look her way. Janice opened a file folder thick with papers and yellowed edges. She didn't smile. She didn't stall. With a brief clearing of her throat, she began. "I, Edith Maynard, being of sound mind and under no duress, do hereby declare this to be my final will and testament." My ears started ringing. To Clarence Doyle, I leave the full contents of my estate, including the house located on Lakewood Drive, the retirement account totaling approximately $230,000, all personal effects, jewelry, and any held stock assets in my possession or name. The room froze. No one moved. The heater clicked off, and the silence that followed was immediate and brutal. Amber shot to her feet. "This is absurd!" Her voice cracked, a brittle screech that bounced off the beige walls. "He's nothing to her. No blood relation, no adoption papers. Just some stray she took in." Marla didn't shout, but her voice cut just as deep. "There's clearly been manipulation. Something is off here. Edith would never do this unless someone put words in her mouth." Gerald muttered, "Well, damn," then leaned back like he was suddenly bored with the whole show. I didn't say a word. My hands sat folded in my lap, but I felt them trembling, the weight of disbelief threading through my fingers like cold water. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not like this. Not in front of them. Not so final and loud. Janice remained calm. "This will was signed, witnessed, and filed with our office 14 months ago. It has passed every verification step." Then, she reached into the folder again. "There's one more item. A letter. Edith's instructions were clear. Mr. Doyle is to read it privately after the reading is complete." She handed me a sealed envelope, pale blue with slightly worn corners. My name was written in her familiar looping script, the kind she always used on birthday cards and sticky notes on the fridge. I took it gently, the tremble in my hands now impossible to hide. I could feel the heat of everyone's eyes, burning, judging, confused. Janice stood. "That concludes the reading. You're all welcome to a copy of the will." The others rose slowly, stunned into silence, resentment simmering just beneath the surface. No one congratulated me. No one offered condolences. No one even looked me in the eye. When they left, I stayed seated. The letter in my hand felt heavier than the room. I slid a finger beneath the flap and opened it. "Clarence, if you're reading this, then I've gone ahead of you. But I didn't leave without telling you why I chose you." Her handwriting was always a little shaky but neat, the kind of script that looked like it came from someone who still sent thank you cards and labeled every jar in the pantry. As I opened the letter and unfolded the pages, it was like her voice filled the empty room, soft and steady in my head. "Clarence," she began, "I still remember the day you came to live with me. You were 12. It was raining. You sat on the porch steps with nothing but a backpack and the weight of being forgotten. You didn't cry. You didn't ask for anything. You just looked up and asked if you could stay the night. I felt my throat tighten. You stayed more than a night. You stayed through every winter storm, every quiet evening, every aching joint I never told you about. You were there when the pipes burst. You were there when the roof leaked. You were there when no one else called. No one else cared. She wrote about the family, the blood relatives. My own children and their children drifted away. They sent cards out of obligation, if at all. Amber once told me, after I fell and broke my arm on the kitchen floor, "That's just what happens when you get old." She didn't even call an ambulance. You did. You found me, barely conscious, and you got me help. You stayed every night I was in the hospital. None of them showed up. Not once. I paused to breathe, to steady myself, but her words kept coming. At one point, I considered splitting everything evenly. It seemed fair. But then I realized fairness isn't about dividing things equally. It's about recognizing who truly gave, who truly stood by you when there was nothing to gain. You never asked for anything, Clarence. You shoveled my walk every winter, fixed my heater, sat with me during my treatments, and never once brought up who would get what when I passed. There was a long paragraph with just one sentence that broke me. Family isn't who shares your blood, Clarence. It's who shows up when you need to feel like you still matter. She ended the letter with, "I'm giving you everything, not because you need it, but because I know you'll never let it go to waste. You'll honor it, just like you honored me." I sat there for a long time, eyes burning, hands trembling around the letter. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. A few days later, the calls started coming. Marla first, then Gerald. Amber sent a long, passive-aggressive email that read more like a legal brief than a letter of mourning. "We just want to ensure everything was done properly," Marla said when I answered. "Edith was 89. You can't tell me her mind was all there. We'd like to request her medical records, maybe challenge the will if it's not reflective of her capacity." I looked around the living room, her living room, still untouched. The scent of lavender hung in the air. I stood by the mantel, phone in hand, and spoke as evenly as I could. "My grandmother was sharp enough to remember who came when she needed help," I said, "and who didn't." They had nothing to say to that. Later that evening, I sat on her old couch and looked out the window as dusk settled in. I thought of the silence after her funeral, the empty chairs, the absence of grief from the people who now demanded fairness. In my heart, I knew this wasn't about what was left behind. It was about what had always been there. Love, loyalty, presence. None of those showed up on paper, but she saw it. She knew. And I wasn't going to let anyone rewrite that truth. I didn't want more. I just couldn't pretend that those who walked away while she lived had the right to divide her memory now that she was gone. The envelope came on a Tuesday. Cream-colored, thick paper embossed with the logo of a law firm Clarence didn't recognize. Inside was a formal notice. Marla and Amber had filed an official challenge against Edith's will. The language was cold, legal. Undue influence, mental decline, exploitation of a vulnerable elder. They were accusing him of manipulating Edith in her final years, suggesting that he had somehow coerced her into rewriting the will to favor himself. Clarence sat in silence, letter in hand, as the clock ticked on the mantel. He could almost hear Edith's voice again. People show who they really are when they think something's at stake. Later that week, things escalated. A small local blog that liked to position itself as the moral conscience of Flint ran a headline. "Family friend speaks out. Young man allegedly took advantage of elderly aunt." The article was laced with unverified quotes and vague accusations, implying that Clarence had isolated Edith, kept her from her family, and swooped in when she was too weak to know better. The comment section was even worse. Strangers called him greedy, cold, a scammer. Someone found an old photo from his HVAC business page and plastered it with the caption, "Would you trust this man with your grandmother's will?" Then came the video. A grainy, shaky clip, clearly from a neighbor's phone, of Clarence lifting Edith into the back of an ambulance last winter. But the audio was distorted, and it had been spliced cruelly. In the edited version, Clarence's voice sounded harsh, urgent, almost aggressive, as if he were barking at her, forcing her into the van. The internet did what it always did, ran with it. By nightfall, Clarence's inbox was flooded with anonymous threats, fake Yelp reviews targeting his small business, and even a voicemail from a number he didn't recognize. Hope the money was worth it, thief? He couldn't sleep that night, so he drove. It was nearly midnight when he pulled up to Edith's old house, his house now. The porch light still worked, and the wooden steps creaked the same way. Inside, it smelled faintly of cedar and cinnamon. He walked through the living room, ran his fingers over the sideboard where she kept her old sewing kit, and finally opened the closet near the stairs. A cardboard box sat tucked in the back. Inside were photo albums, thick, heavy ones, worn from decades of turning pages. There were pictures of him as a boy, barely reaching her waist. One where he was helping her plant tulips. Another from a Thanksgiving dinner, the two of them laughing over a burnt pie. And tucked into the lid of the box, a single photo of them in the backyard. He was raking leaves. She was sitting on a lawn chair, grinning. On the back, in Edith's familiar script, it read, "Family is where love doesn't have to fight for its place." He sat down on the floor and just stared at that photo. The next morning, his lawyer called, asking if he wanted to release a statement, counter the claims, set the record straight. "No," Clarence said quietly. "Let them talk." "You sure?" "The video." "I'm sure," he replied. "I won't shout to prove what she already knew." Instead, he asked the lawyer to begin compiling every document Edith had signed in the last year, bank forms, hospital releases, the will itself, all in her handwriting, all lucid. They would let the facts speak when the time came. That evening, as the sky turned a soft orange, Clarence walked down the hallway of the old wooden house. The walls were lined with photos and postcards, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he had to defend his place in that house, because he knew he belonged there. And deep down, so did she. It was the sound of gravel crunching under slow tires that brought Clarence out to the porch that afternoon. The old Buick rolled to a stop, and out stepped Mr. Greg Whitman, thick glasses, flat cap, suspenders stretched over a soft gray cardigan. Clarence hadn't seen him since the funeral. The older man gave him a small nod, then looked at the house, as if checking to make sure time hadn't erased it. "I figured it was time," Greg said simply. Inside, over warm tea that neither of them touched, Greg reached into his coat and pulled out a worn envelope. "She asked me to keep this," he said, "just in case." Clarence took it with quiet hands. Inside was a folded note in Edith's handwriting. "If they come crawling back with lawsuits and false concern, please tell them. I knew exactly what I was doing. I was tired of pretending that blood equals love." Greg didn't stop there. He pulled out a flash drive. "This," he said, tapping it gently, "was her idea too. We were supposed to record her reading the will," she said. "Not for proof, Greg. Just so I can hear myself say it one more time while I still have strength." He paused. "She never told me to release it publicly, but maybe it's time." Clarence didn't trust his voice enough to say thank you. He just gripped Greg's hand with more force than he meant to, then watched the older man leave in the same silence he'd arrived in. The next day, Clarence was called to a mediation meeting at the law office. Amber was there, not in fur and lipstick this time, but a wrinkled coat, bags under her eyes, nails bitten raw. When the door shut, she broke down. "I didn't want this," she said, voice trembling. "Mom made me. She said she'd cut me off completely if I didn't sign." Clarence folded his arms. "So you thought lying was better than being broke?" Amber looked down. "I'm in debt, Clarence. Deep. Creditors are circling. I didn't know what else to do." He didn't yell, didn't raise his voice, just asked quietly, "And has your mother ever taught you any way to get something that didn't involve taking it from someone else?" Amber's face crumpled. In that moment, Clarence saw it. Amber wasn't the root. She was a product, a pawn, the one who always wanted to please, to be loved, but never learned how to stand up for herself. The puppet strings had never left her hands. They were clenched by Marla. That night, another envelope arrived in his mailbox. This one handwritten, shaky cursive on the front. To Clarence. Inside was a note from Mrs. Howard, the elderly woman next door to Edith's house. "Dear Clarence, I don't know if you remember, but last winter you fixed my pipe when it burst at midnight. You wouldn't even take my $20. More than that, I watched you take Miss Edith to every single eye appointment, even when the roads were icy. I don't know what's going on with all these news stories, but I'll sign anything you need. I saw the truth. You loved her like family, more than her real one ever did." Attached was a signed affidavit. The dam had cracked. Clarence started pulling everything together. The photos he found in the wooden box, with Edith's handwritten notes. The video Greg gave him, showing Edith calm, articulate, firm in her decision. Letters from neighbors, old cards she wrote him with tiny messages like, "Thank you for the garden hose, champ." And, "Only you remember I like cinnamon, not mint." Each piece wasn't just evidence, it was memory, proof of a bond that had nothing to do with blood. The legal battle would come. Marla's accusations would grow sharper. But Clarence wasn't afraid. "If they want to take what was never theirs," he told his attorney, "then I'll let truth speak louder than noise." That evening, Clarence walked to the edge of the property, where the lake shimmered under a darkening sky. The water was still, only rippled by the faint wind. He stood there, hands in his coat pockets, staring at the place Edith had loved most. He whispered, "I don't know if you can still see this, Grandma, but I promise, I won't let them turn your love into something ugly. I won't let them stain what we built, even if you're not here anymore." And for a moment, in the hush of twilight, it felt like the lake was listening. The courthouse was already buzzing when I arrived. A small crowd had gathered outside, family I hadn't spoken to in years, distant relatives with tight-lipped expressions, and a handful of local reporters clutching notepads and holding up phones. The kind of people who only show up for spectacle, not support. But I didn't flinch. I walked through the doors with my attorney beside me and a heavy folder box in my arms, full of every truth they ever tried to bury. Inside, the courtroom was solemn and cold. Polished wood, high ceilings, and that quiet that only exists in rooms where judgment is passed. On the left side sat Marla, Amber, and a few cousins I hadn't seen since childhood. Marla's face was all sharp edges, painted lips pursed with confidence, but her eyes darted just a little too quickly. Amber looked smaller than usual, her hands trembling ever so slightly. She wouldn't meet my gaze. The judge entered, and the room rose. Formalities came and went until the gavel tapped. Then it was our turn. My attorney stood first, voice calm and clipped. She presented everything we had. The photos of me and Grandma planting tulips in the spring, her handwritten notes behind each framed picture in the hallway, the signed affidavits from neighbors, the medical records proving her clarity of mind, and then finally, the video. It flickered to life on the screen, soft lighting, and Edith's familiar voice, a little raspy but unmistakably firm. She read her will aloud, word for word, with deliberate pauses, as if she wanted every sentence to land where it belonged. Then came the part that held the room captive. I leave what I have to the person who never asked, never expected, and never walked away. I leave it to Clarence, not because of obligation, but because of love. A few gasps, some shifting in the benches, and then came the end of the recording. One moment I had almost forgotten. The camera wobbled as Greg leaned closer to her. She reached out, took my hand off screen, and smiled. If anyone asks why, just show them this. They'll see what I saw. The screen faded to black. Silence hung like a thick curtain. Marla's attorney fumbled to respond. She mumbled something about undue influence and emotional manipulation, but even she didn't sound convinced. Marla rose, demanding more time to gather further evidence. The judge didn't budge. You've had over a year to prepare. I see no valid grounds to delay. You could feel the air shift. Tension rolled through the room like a storm cloud. Amber sat frozen, her eyes locked on the floor. And then, without a word, she stood, grabbed her coat, and walked out. No one stopped her. Marla was alone now, her voice rising as her case crumbled, but the court had moved on. Before closing, I asked to say a few words. I stood slowly, heart steady. I'm not here to fight for what's mine, I began. I'm here because someone I loved deeply chose to leave something behind. Not just a house or money, but the memory of being seen, of being cared for. I turned slightly toward the gallery. She deserved more than silence in her final years, and I will not let her love be reduced to a bargaining chip. The judge nodded once. In light of the evidence, this court finds the will to be valid and lawfully executed. The estate shall remain with Mr. Clarence Whitlow. Marla stood up abruptly, voice shaking with rage. So everything goes to a boy she wasn't even related to by blood? The judge looked directly at her. Because he was the only one who didn't leave her. She sat back down, stunned into silence. The gavel fell. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long gold streaks across the courthouse steps. I stood for a moment before walking forward. For the first time in a long while, I lifted my face toward the sky and whispered to no one and to someone all at once. You see that, Grandma? They can't hurt you anymore. A few days after the court ruling, my phone buzzed with a name I didn't expect to see again. Amber. No text, no preamble, just a call. For a minute, I stared at it, thumb hovering over decline. But something in me, maybe it was exhaustion, maybe something deeper, pressed answer. Her voice was quiet, trembling. She asked to meet, said it wasn't about the house or the will, just a talk. We met at a small diner by the lake, one our family used to go to after Sunday service when we were still young enough to believe Sunday meant anything. The place hadn't changed much. Same chipped tabletops, same vinyl booths that stuck to your skin in summer. But we had. Amber looked tired. Not in the way makeup could fix, but in the way regret wears on a person. Her eyes were rimmed red, though she hadn't started crying yet. That came later. I didn't want the money, she said after our coffees arrived. I couldn't bear watching Mom lose. Not because she was right, but because losing meant facing who she really is. I didn't answer right away. I just watched her. And what about you? I asked. Have you ever thought about where you were? When Grandma needed someone to just be there? She looked down, stirred her coffee even though she hadn't put sugar in. I knew, she whispered. I knew she'd fallen. The week before she died. I saw the bruise when I stopped by to drop off decorations. She tried to downplay it, said she was fine. And? Mom told me not to say anything, said if we brought it up, the party would get postponed, and she'd already put 17 grand into catering and the tent. Said, old people bruise like peaches, She'll be fine. And I believed her. Or maybe I just didn't want to start a fight. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. There it was. The truth. Ugly and raw. I'm not angry at you anymore, I said finally. Because now, I don't expect anything from you. I stood to leave and placed an envelope on the table. Amber reached for it like it might burn her. It's a letter, I said. Grandma wrote it a year before she passed. Read it. Not to cry, just to understand. I walked out, letting the bell above the door jingle one last time. A week passed. Then, on a quiet Sunday morning, Amber showed up again. This time at the small memorial I'd organized at the house by the lake. No press, no extended family. Just a few of Grandma's neighbors, friends, and people she'd touched in quiet, everyday ways. Mr. Pollard, the retired janitor whose heater I'd fixed during a snowstorm. Mrs. Nguyen, who brought over sweet tea every Sunday for no reason. And Greg, of course, with that same slow smile and a camera he didn't bother to raise. I kept it simple. I don't want this house to be an asset, I told them. I want it to be a living memory, a place where love happened. Afterward, Amber approached me again. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, worn, but glinting faintly in the afternoon light. A delicate opal necklace. She gave me this when I was 8. Amber said. Told me it would bring me calm. I wore it once, then forgot about it. Just like I forgot her. She pressed it into my hand. It doesn't belong to me anymore. Maybe it never did. No apology, but something more real. Days turned into weeks. I submitted my resignation at the HVAC company, kept just enough hours to cover bills, but freed up the rest. With what I had, I started renovating the lake house, not for Airbnb or tourists, but for the elderly in town who had nowhere to go during the holidays. No reservations, no payment required. Just warmth, a seat at the table, and maybe a familiar song playing from the old record player. It wasn't much, but it was enough. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the trees and lit Lakewood in a golden shimmer, I stood at the dock with a small urn in hand. I scattered the last of Grandma's ashes over the water. They swirled, danced in the air, then sank gently into the lake's quiet embrace. You once said, I murmured, that if you had to go, you wanted to melt into the place you loved most. I stayed there a while, watching the ripples fade. Not because I had anything left to say, but because for the first time, I didn't need to. Peace, it turns out, doesn't come from winning. It comes when there's nothing left to prove. Sometimes it's not about winning a battle. It's about standing for something when silence feels easier. Love doesn't come with bloodlines or contracts. It's proven in the quiet moments, the hard choices, the unwavering presence. In the end, truth finds its voice, even when whispered. If this story moved you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, share your experience, and don't forget to follow the channel for more stories that speak to the heart.